Morning, everyone. This morning, we're going to look at how and why we set targets for climate action. We're also going to look at what current targets are in place and discuss what this means for Scotland. But first, why do we set targets? Well, setting targets gives us an agreed objective. We can then work backwards from this goal to understand what the choices are we need to make and when to achieve our aim. It's kind of like athletes preparing for an upcoming race. They create a training schedule, they adapt a diet. Without figuring out and following this plan, it's unlikely they'll succeed. And the later they make a start, the more severe the training will be. And that's a similar scenario for tackling climate change. Unfortunately, coming up with global targets and a plan hasn't been straightforward. Although climate change is going to affect all countries on some level, agreeing on a global course of action has been challenging due to competing interests. Many countries, like Scotland, have relied on fossil fuels to develop their economies and improve the well-being of their people. These countries are now moving away from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources and want other countries to do the same. But some countries in this global south, like India, for example, are frustrated because they feel it's unfair that they're being asked to cut back on their emissions whilst they're still developing, when other countries were able to rely on fossil fuels for so long. They're concerned it could halt their social progress or harm their economies. There are also countries whose economies rely on extracting and selling fossil fuels, and they've been resistant to climate action. For example, the US, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Kuwait rejected a report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that highlighted the need to limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Finally, there's also other countries that are going to feel the effects of climate change the most, but have barely contributed to causing it and don't have the resources to adapt to it. Some countries in Africa, for example. So you can see that getting everyone to agree on how best to tackle climate change is difficult because everyone's looking at it from different perspectives. But in Paris in 2015, at a United Nations conference on climate change, almost all countries signed an agreement, now known as the Paris Agreement, to limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius and to pursue a limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, when we talk about limiting global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, we're comparing current global average temperatures to pre-industrial levels, roughly 200 years ago, before we began to develop machinery that required burning fossil fuels. Included in the Paris Agreement is a commitment for greenhouse gas emissions to peak as soon as possible. The longer we delay the peak, meaning the point where emissions switch from increasing to decreasing, the more difficult it will be to limit global warming. So if we look at this graph, if we don't peak our global emissions soon, then we'll have to reduce them at a steeper, more dramatic rate. And that will mean introducing more drastic measures. The ultimate goal for all countries is to reach net zero. Now, by net, we mean that the total emissions add up to zero. So we can still produce some emissions, but we need to find a way to take them out of the atmosphere again. This is a process called carbon offsetting. For example, we can plant trees which absorb carbon dioxide from the air. You can see on the left-hand side of this slide that in 1990, a lot of the carbon dioxide emissions were produced by various sectors. But on the right-hand side of the scales, very little was being absorbed by forests and peatlands. So the scales weren't balanced. In contrast, we hope the scales will be balanced by 2045, and the amount of carbon dioxide produced being equal to the amount absorbed. At this point, we'll have reached net zero. As you can see from this bar chart, as of 2017, we're still producing more carbon dioxide emissions than we're storing via carbon sinks. A carbon sink is something that absorbs more carbon dioxide than it produces. Each country is expected to make its own pledge on how it will lower its emissions to help reach these global targets. Every 5 years, countries are expected to revisit their commitments and improve on them. This year, all the countries were intending to meet again in Glasgow at a global conference called COP26 to update their targets. But this has been delayed until November 2021 because of coronavirus. Also written into the Paris Agreement is a commitment to a principle of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. I'll unpack what that means, but in short, it's a commitment to share the burden of climate change fairly. Starting with equity. Some countries are currently bigger emitters than others. On this pie chart, if we look at the second ring in, we can see that collectively, the top 10 emitters account for nearly 3/4 of global emissions. So when the Paris Agreement talks about equity, it's implying that countries with higher emissions than the global average should reduce their emissions more rapidly. This data is based on annual emissions, however. If we take into account total emissions added up over the past century, we get a different picture. And that brings us on to responsibility. This chart shows the top 10 countries with the largest total carbon dioxide emissions since 1750. This is really important because once greenhouse gases are released into the atmosphere, they can stick around for hundreds of years and continue to contribute to the greenhouse effect. As you can see, the UK ranks 5th. That's because Britain was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. So whilst we might be a small country, we've relied on fossil fuels for a lot longer than other countries. The Paris Agreement uses the term differentiated responsibilities to show that countries that have benefited considerably from fossil fuels should again reduce emissions faster than the global average. And finally, we have to consider which countries can afford or are capable of making the changes needed. On this map, the darker shaded countries are wealthier in terms of gross domestic product. In 2019, the UK ranked 6th for GDP out of 203 countries. So some people feel that richer countries or countries that have the ability to cut emissions faster should do so. Again, going back to the Paris Climate Agreement, written into the treaty, there are obligations for developed countries to support the efforts of developing countries through financial and technological provisions. So it isn't just about the capability of a country to reduce its own emissions, but also how they're able to help others. So what does all this mean for Scotland? In 2018, the Scottish Government asked the Committee on Climate Change to suggest what Scotland's climate targets should be in the context of the Paris Agreement. They suggested that Scotland should reach net zero by 2045, which is 5 years ahead of the target advised for the whole of the UK, because Scotland's judged to have better resources to reduce emissions. For example, it's well placed for wind and tidal power. The Scottish Parliament also set legally binding interim targets of 75% reduction by 2030 and 90% by 2040. People often say that it doesn't matter what Scotland does, we only contribute 0.1% of global emissions. But if we go back to those 3 key principles, equity, responsibility and capability in the Paris Agreement, we can understand then what Scotland does will matter. Starting with responsibility and equity. Scotland has had a long history of extracting and using fossil fuels, from coal mining at Caldross that dates back to 1575 to North Sea oil today. We also have slightly higher CO2 emissions per person than the average globally. Additionally, Scotland's rich not just in monetary wealth, but rich in resources, including renewable energy potential and also land capital. We have large areas of peatlands which can absorb and store carbon dioxide. So we could argue that Scotland has the capabilities. Scotland has a huge opportunity to demonstrate global leadership on climate change, and in doing so, bring benefits to people here in Scotland, such as new green jobs, warmer homes, and better air quality. We've also got to be careful when we talk about 0.1% emissions, because that's referring to domestic emissions only, meaning those that occur directly in Scotland. But as the world has become more global and Scotland has become less industrial, a lot of what we use or eat isn't grown or manufactured in this country at all. It's made somewhere else. So we then have to consider these outputs, which are called consumption emissions. As you can see from this graph, both Scotland's consumption emissions and domestic emissions have been falling have been falling, while its GDP has been increasing. This is a great message that Scotland can share, as it shows that reducing emissions doesn't mean becoming poorer. The Scottish Government has produced a climate change plan which sets out the policies intended to deliver its interim targets. This is currently being updated to reflect the new net zero target of 2045. The plan's helpful for seeing what's already in place or will be soon, but Scottish ministers also want to know what changes citizens want to see. And of course, that is where Scotland's Climate Assembly comes in. There isn't one easy rule book to follow for reaching net zero, unfortunately. Tackling climate change is going to take many different approaches and many different ways of thinking. But as you move through the Assembly, it may be worth considering what responsibility Scotland does have. What changes are we capable of making? And how can we make sure that we're doing our fair share? All aspects of our lives are connected to climate change, which means that there are a lot of topics to cover over the next 6 months. To make it easier, we'll be splitting you all into 3 different groups from weekends 3 and 4. This will allow you to explore a specific area in depth and look at what options are available. What are the consequences? What are the trade-offs that we may need to make? You'll be split into 3 groups by random selection, similar to the way that you were recruited to the Assembly itself, with each group still representing Scotland in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, etc. You'll still have the opportunity to hear about the other topic areas. They'll be introduced to you all in more detail in weekend 2. And in weekend 5, you'll all come back together to share what you've been learning and deliberate with one another. The 3 different streams are houses and communities. This group will study topics like how we heat our homes, as well as how we use public spaces. Diet and lifestyle. This group will consider what we consume, not just food, but also clothes and other goods. Work and travel. The final group will look at how we get around, the types of jobs we do, and our working environments.